Foundation's webinar on the Vulnerability Reduction Credit Framework. And as many of you know, we had a few audio sound issues during our initial session on September 9th. However, many people showed enough interest to stay through to the end of that webinar, and we decided to do a reboot of that session this evening. We decided we would dust off our landlines and diversify our risk on audio. And just for the record, this webinar is being recorded, including the chat box. We will be sharing the recording link and have it on our website for future reference. Now, I'm Carl Schultz, Executive Chairman and founder of the Higher Ground Foundation, and I'll be taking turns co-moderating. We'll be discussing the Foundation's Vulnerability Reduction Credit Framework, which is admittedly quite a mouthful, so from here on we'll call it the VRC. And this will be a little different from other webinars that we've hosted, and that it'll be a little more interactive. Instead of 3 consecutive presentations followed by a Q&A session with the audience, our guests, including me, will hold a discussion. Now, of course, we'll be taking online questions throughout the session, which you can enter into the chat box at the bottom of your screens. We'll attempt to answer as many as possible after the main discussion is over. Most of those questions that we discuss will aim to be a sort of a more general nature, as we're going to be holding a 30-minute technical sandbox discussion after the main Q&A session for anyone who's interested in digging further into the standard framework. Our panel members are Linus Adler, co-founder and technical manager of the Higher Ground Foundation, who will lay out some basic groundwork on what vulnerability reduction credits VRCs are. He'll be followed by Higher Ground's development manager, Andrew Aruku, who will be joining us via a pre-recorded presentation from Uganda to discuss issues about the potential for project activities, specifically in northeast Uganda. Finally, I'll be talking about the VRC standard framework itself. As you can see, in the previous session, Ann Goodman, a strategic advisor to the Higher Ground Foundation and author, educator, and facilitator, was with us on our first one. Now, unfortunately, she cannot be with us today as she is busy promoting her new book on emerging business approaches to climate change, Adapting to Change, the Business of Climate Resilience. Now, I'm joined first by Linus Adler, the technical manager of the Higher Ground Foundation. Linus's educational background is economics. Since moving from the U.S. to Great Britain in 2006, he has worked as a consultant in the strategic energy sector and has helped co-found the Higher Ground Foundation back in 2011. For the Higher Ground, he is contributing technical analysis and modeling of the impacts of climate change on societal and economic well-being to establish baselines, monitoring, and additionality criteria. Linus, could we start with a bit of background? For those new to the concept, could you explain what exactly a VRC, a Vulnerability Reduction Credit, is in terms of how it works and why we developed it?
Sure. First of all, thank you very much, Carl, for that introduction. And if it's okay, I will try to start a bit with the why first. Well, why? The need to finance climate change adaptation is becoming increasingly clear. And the scope of this need, on the order of $100 billion a year right now and growing, is definitely crystallized. And already there's a considerable amount of aid finance being spent on adaptation. Well, national and local governments are already spending considerable amounts on it, and several reports indicate that developing countries are spending multiples more of their own funds on adaptation than they're receiving in international assistance. And the private sector is also in the game too, out of necessity, in order to secure their supply chain for investment and insurance reasons, and also to meet their targets for CSR, corporate social responsibility. So there's already investment decisions, policy making, and finance for adaptation going on. So right now there is a value in improving the decision making and potential to deploy resources more effectively. So we're approaching this from the point of view that if a price can be put on adaptation in a unified manner, a mechanism such as the VRC, the Vulnerability Reduction Credit, can act as a signal to get private sector entities more involved and to leverage finance in order to reduce climate vulnerability.
So tell me then, what exactly is a VRC?
Well, let me give you our elevator pitch. The Vulnerability Reduction Credit, or VRC, represents 50 euros of avoided climate change damage that doesn't necessarily cost 50 euros to create. Functionally, it's made of three terms. First is the avoided impact cost, and then there's what we call the income equalization factor, which helps us normalize incomes on a worldwide basis. Finally, the product of these is divided by 50 euros per credit to give you the number of credits a project earns.
That's interesting. Still perhaps a little bit complicated. Maybe you could unpack this a little bit further for those of us who aren't trained economists.
Okay, well, let me look at it from another approach. The IPCC's fourth assessment report cited three critical components of vulnerability. The first is exposure, which is the value of what's at risk. For a community, this can mean capital and income. It could also mean direct human values such as health and access to nutrition, or even more slightly intangible values such as access to education or equality, for instance. The second factor they identify is sensitivity, which is the potential for damage to stock and flows owing to climate change. In our formulation, avoided impact reflects exposure and insensitivity, not insensitivity. And finally, the third factor they identify is adaptive capacity, which is the resilience of the community against climate change to which they're sensitive. Adaptive capacity can arise from many capital sources. For instance, wealth generation capacity, cultural and social capital, or governance practices. Here, the adaptive capacity is reflected by the income equalization factor. So, as shown in the slide, the VRC formula restates the IPCC's formulation in an analytical manner. In fact, it gives it as a cash value.
A cash value? How so? And isn't that a bit constrained or limiting?
Well, we look at it this way. A fundamental premise of VRCs is that there are many aspects of community and human values. And while economic well-being never equates precisely to human well-being, we do use the VRC mechanism on a basis of a derived monetary value for avoided impacts. We do this, and it's useful because cost-benefit analysis is fairly well understood, and it's an accepted approach to valuation. It's also important to do this because it allows us to remove the codependency of many factors in order to concentrate on impacts that are most universal. In other words, impacts on the ability of communities to have a secure material livelihood.
Yeah, and it's true that security of communities is very critical. But what do you mean by codependency?
Yeah, well, we don't want to double count value. When you consider something like flood damage, for instance, you could look at loss in health owing to floods, or you could look at capital replacement costs. But if you did both, you'd be double counting the impacts, and we really need to stick to one or the other to have a coherent VRC analysis. So when making a choice, we choose the option that can be better counted using monetary terms, using cost-benefit type analysis.
There's that last term, the income equalization factor, the IEF. Could you talk a bit about what exactly is involved there?
Yeah, sure. Well, as I noted in the last slide, we can equate the adaptive capacity to we can equate the adaptive capacity to what we call the income equalization factor, or IEF. In effect, the higher the IEF is, the lower the assumed adaptive capacity. So why do we use the IEF? We do it to equalize loss and damage estimates across communities that might have vastly differing per capita incomes. If we didn't do this, funding would tend to go towards higher income communities because their incomes and capital have a higher denominator value, which means that all things being equal with an IEF, they would have they would generate more VRCs. So even though to the people living in the lower income communities, their livelihoods and infrastructure are just as important to them.
Okay, yeah, I can definitely see why leveling the playing field would be important. Otherwise, everything would go to the wealthiest with the most assets, using the approach we're using. But now that you've highlighted a bit on what goes under the hood, if you're in America, or bonnet, if you're in the UK, of a VRC, could you speak a bit to the value it really adds? What do we get from an adaptation project that generates VRCs that we don't get from, what can you call it, a plain vanilla, a project that doesn't use this approach?
Yeah, well, let me list some benefits. Sorry, wrong slide here. Let me list some benefits. The adaptation project template is currently still evolving. Many existing projects, they simply use conventional development methodologies, and they just tack the term climate change adaptation on, and voila, you have a climate change project. In another manner, a number of national governments and aid agencies do have monitoring and evaluation systems in place, but there's been considerable criticism of how adaptation is evaluated under these systems, and sometimes they fail to consider sufficiently climate change projections and impact assessment. So the critical thing that the VRC mechanism adds is consistency and quantifiability to the adaptation space.
So what we're doing is we're coming up with an instrument that reflects the results of adaptation, yes, but what would you envision would be the actual practical applications and uses for the VRC?
Well, there are a few we've identified so far, and there are many other possibilities. First of all, VRCs are in effect a monitoring and evaluation tool, and they can be used as a cost-effective standalone or in conjunction with other M&E tools. Second, putting a price on VRCs for trading or retiring them can allow VRCs to be used to secure project finance. Governments can use the VRC to set their targets for domestic or international assistance on climate adaptation. And VRCs can also be used as a tool for rating companies, governments, and investments, and other investors for investment decision making.
Yes, I'd have to say I can see how the VRCs could be very helpful, but now that you've explained some of these benefits, could you focus on what might be some challenges or potential pitfalls or risks involved with VRCs?
Yeah, well, right now I think the greatest potential for problems we have in the mechanism is that it's new and it's complex. What we have needs to be made more robust than what's already out there in the adaptation space. And we hope that we can get a standard for VRCs up and running to the point where project developers and communities around the world can take our standard methodologies, plug in mechanics of involved in complicated economic factors and climate science, and out of the process come up with a single figure, the VRC stream, that indicates a single value for the project. And we need to be able to do this at scale. So obviously a lot of work and planning is going to be needed to standardize the process and to manage inevitable uncertainties in a consistent and defensible manner. So that's why we're so keen on getting our standard framework together, which goes back to why we asked you to attend this evening. And Carl will address the standard framework in more detail later.
Well, that I will, and I'd like to thank you very much, Linus, for that succinct and I hope very useful discussion of the basics on VRCs. So thank you.
Thanks, Carl.
Next, we're joined from Soroti in northeastern Uganda by Andrew Oluku, who will be discussing some of the climate challenges facing that part of the world. As a bit of an introduction to Andrew, he's a public health and supply chain specialist and has an international diploma in humanitarian assistance from Fordham University in New York, and also holds a bachelor's of laboratory technology. His experience spans 9 years in sub-Saharan Africa.
My name is Andrew Oluku from Uganda. I come from the northeastern part of the country. Andrew has a long track record of international experience with professional companies operating in Uganda, Botswana, Tanzania, Malawi, Sierra Leone, and Liberia. And he's acquainted with the absolutely best of professional practices. So as I said, owing to some technical risks, we've tested these out, and we've decided a recording is the way to go for his. So, Andrew, it's over to you. I've introduced. My name is Andrew Oluku from Uganda. I come from the northeastern part of the country. I'm going to talk briefly about VRCs for climate change adaptation in Uganda, a case study for northeastern part of Uganda. Like they've already introduced me, I'm a public health expert who has a lot of interest in climate change. In Uganda in general, 80% of the livelihood depend on agriculture, which is mostly rain-fed. The crops include cassava, potatoes, sweet potatoes, millet, sorghum, and pigeon peas. These are vulnerable to climate change, especially due to temperature increase, which can increase evapotranspiration and wither crops. More variable rainfalls as a result, which can create problems with the drought and proper timing of planting. Buildings and people are also vulnerable to flooding, which is expected to become more erratic. The health, the water, the biodiversity, tourism are all affected by climate change. The regional transitioning from pastoralism to agriculture is also experiencing challenges as the herdsmen or herders are taking up farming. This will stress further the existing land sources and create conflict, and climate change will probably exacerbate this transition. Also, although the effects of climate change worldwide and at a local level are becoming increasingly visible, as per 2014 to 2016 being the hottest period in the recorded history in Uganda, all we know of the future effects must come from climate change modeling. Best known estimates show that Northeast Africa, the temperatures are increasing from 1.5 to 4.3 degrees from 2040 to 2080, with the rainfall increasing through at least in 2050.
For the 11 model crops in Uganda, especially in Uganda and overall, most models show that negative impacts under all climate scenarios to 2050, especially cassava, potatoes, show that over 40% in decline in the harvest, whereas millet, sorghum, and pigeon peas show that less than 10% of decline. The major divergence in the outcome between the regions, the north and the east, are as shown in the following impacts. The impacts are mainly for the wealth, although some upsets are there. The bad ones especially are the increased temperatures impact are excessive heat stress, which affects the crops, the animal, and the people. Then the flooding impacts, the crop damages, the building damages, disease vector enhancement, e.g. mosquitoes, borne diseases. These are some of the impacts that we are seeing. However, the picture is not all bad. Some studies suggest that sorghum production in northeastern Uganda will increase under increased rainfall. In addition to being a major food crop, sorghum growings will act as a source of cash income. Sorghum beer has been an export growth area for about 10 years, or in the last 10 years in the northeastern part of the country. What can VRCs do for us in northeastern part of the country? There is a very big potential and a broad potential for VRCs projects in the region. Such projects and activities could be used to improve the financing, to set a price, and then local people can find new opportunity and new funds to adapt to climate change. It also enables the certainty of outcomes. Also, VRCs could encourage development of more climate-friendly crops like sorghum. VRC's modeling could clarify what is potential and what is risky. This will help communities to decide what to prioritize. Given the climate upsides, for instance, increase in the yield of crops such as sorghum, VRCs could also be used to optimize income by providing seed finance for sorghum farming and brewing operations. With this audience, I will come briefly to the end of my session concerning northeastern part of the country. I'll now hand you over to one of my colleagues in the audience who will take you up with the next features in our webinar. Thank you very much. Again, welcome to Uganda.
Okay, well, thanks in absentia for that, Andrew. I'd like to shift gears to the third part of our session, to consider in greater depth how to translate what is an intriguing and promising concept into a practical instrument. So the Higher Ground Foundation has been on the creation of a standard framework, and Carl Schultz, the creator of the VRC concept, will discuss their efforts. Sorry. A little bit about Carl. He started out as an urban planner, working in West Africa on environmental management at the city level, And then he joined the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency to work in its Global Change Division. For a decade, he managed voluntary programs with the fossil energy sector in order to reduce fugitive greenhouse gas emissions. After moving to London in 2003, he created and co-created a number of startups in the energy consultancy and clean energy space. Starting in 2009, his interest shifted to climate impacts and adaptation assessments and the economics thereof. Shortly into this work, he conceived of the VRC, and with a team of like-minded professionals, he co-founded the Higher Ground Foundation in 2011. So, Carl, previously I discussed some hopefully compelling reasons why the world can benefit from VRCs, and Andrew's presentation helped put some flesh on the idea by placing it within the context of adaptation measures in Northeast Africa. Could you tell me, what do you mean by a standard framework, and what is its relevance in the overall scheme?
Yeah, you discussed the VRC concept, and the VRC concept by itself is just that. What we really need, however, is an instrument that's ready for use in the real world, where there's climate vulnerability, where there are project opportunities, but where there's complexity, and where there's differing ways that one can articulate results. So we've had to dig down a fair bit deeper than just the conceptual level and ask ourselves a lot of really critical questions regarding how a project ought to qualify for VRCs and under what conditions. And this means considering the principles guiding what counts, how it can count, and when there are different ways of interpreting an input into VRCs, which approach ought to be accepted. So a team at Higher Ground, and there's quite a number, and I thank them all, have worked with us together jointly to spend well over a year meeting and considering options, and we've drafted a standard framework that we are now hoping to validate with the help of outside expertise.
Okay, well, thanks. Could you tell me, what does the standard framework consist of? What does it look like?
Okay, well, let me do this by showing you the table of contents. So, okay, this is the just beginning here. Basically, we go through a process that others who have worked on standards development might find very familiar. In fact, we have taken a lot of inspiration and ideas from the project-based carbon mitigation standards. Starting points include understanding the process and the principles for the standard framework. And so when we go into the requirements for developing specific methodologies, that's the next step. That's really very important.
What do you mean?
Well, if you want to get a project registered, you first need to use a methodology that is specific to a certain general type of projects or sector. It could be like reducing climate-induced flooding or reducing drought-related losses to agricultural production.
Okay, so if I look at the methodology requirements, does that mean there's another level of guidance needed beyond the standard framework?
Yes, that's what the methodology requires. So this is guidance on developing methodologies for a sector. And to state more precisely how a project could be registered based on the type of measurement, the basis for understanding how a flood defense could be determined to reduce flood risk, and how it could be monitored over time to show it is continuing to reduce flood risks, and so on. So we're looking and working on a number of methodologies for some very important project types right now. But the key to all methodologies and the projects that use these methodologies is that they have to follow the same general process and principles that are defined in our standard framework. So let me show you the contents of the project requirements. That's subordinate to the methodology, but within the standard framework.
Okay, so beyond the concept, you need a standard framework, a project-type methodology, and then you need to meet certain standards and document them for each project, right?
Yeah.
It seems a bit complicated.
Now, making projects robust, but as uncomplicated as possible, is the reason we have developed the framework. The project type methodologies are what project developers need to focus on, along with the project requirements that are clearly spelled out. And we also are developing methodology and project document templates to make it simpler to actually put it into practice.
All right. Well, could you describe why methodologies are so important?
Because we need to ensure the projects we register and the credits we issue are based on a sound, consistent, transparent basis. We can't have a system that credits two projects, similar projects, based on very different fundamental assumptions. Everything needs to be clear, well, as clear as it can be, and this is why the VRC system has a lot of value added. You can state with a reasonable degree of confidence that if you've gained more VRCs, you have certifiably, if you will, reduced more community vulnerability to climate change against what could be the agreed upon approach.
Okay, yeah, well, certainly quantification is important. Does the methodology require having a PhD to develop these projects, though? And isn't following this process going to take a lot of time and cost a lot of money?
Initially, when the first project methodologies are being developed, there's definitely a need for specialist expertise to cover all of the various questions around how one assesses the impact costs, and how much a particular intervention can reduce those impact costs, and also looking at the other issues around it that will be discussed when we consider baseline and principles. But once we have these methodologies and a few related projects are registered, it's going to become much easier, and overall costs should decline. And we'll be learning a lot of valuable lessons on the most effective ways to enhance resilience that one could say that the knowledge will grow and grow, and the world will become more resilient with more solutions made much more clear. But let me jump to the last section of the table of contents now.
Okay, yeah, this makes sense. You need to do monitoring, and you need to validate the monitoring reports. How does the overall process work? Okay,
effective sustained monitoring, just to talk about this specific issue of monitoring and verification, is critical for the integrity of the system. In fact, it's the basis for the credit issuance. The monitoring reports, the precursor after validation, verification, that leads to issuance. As for the overall VRC process, let me show you how it flows. Here's the simplified process diagram. Now, once a project has been designed and documented to our standards, it's submitted to an accredited third-party validator. If the validator is convinced these standards are met, the project may submit to Higher Ground for registration. Higher Ground goes through a final review, publishes the project document, and the project may then be registered.
But what does registration do for a project? Does it give it credits then?
No, it just qualifies to get credits, but I do not want to dismiss the importance of that milestone of registration. Some parties, like funders, might agree to purchase credits at this point, and others, like banks, might want to use registration status to determine that the project is bankable and thus release finance for the project. But then the project is implemented, and it needs to follow that monitoring plan that proves that the project is maintained to offer sustained, and that's important, it's sustained vulnerability reduction. And when the project has operated for a period and kept up its monitoring reports, and the third party has verified that all or part of the anticipated VRCs may be issued, then we can issue the credits.
Okay, well, yeah, that does sound reasonable. However, the last item on the 10-year revalidation, it's still not clear. Could you elaborate on that?
A lot can change in 10 years. All projects need to revisit the standard methodology, quantify how the baseline has shifted, and this could be maybe owing to better climate projections, or maybe owing to greater or lesser economic prosperity in the community, perhaps as a count of adaptation projects that have enhanced the economic status or slow down decline, but also the project might have a much better understanding of how the adaptation measures have been effective and improvements can be integrated at this time.
Okay, interesting. But why don't you just revisit the situation whenever a project needs or wants to get more credits?
So you're saying revisit the baseline, the revalidation after a year or two? Is that what you're?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's overkill, in my opinion. It also means that the projects that might be backed by project finance, supported by a VRC purchase agreement, wouldn't have as much investor confidence in a full 10 years of potential credit issuance.
Okay, fair enough. Do you think the audience want to understand a little bit more about these principles that they've referenced, that have been referenced here?
Absolutely, yes, certainly, Linus.
And I believe
yeah, it's here. Here we go. The core of the standard is its principles. We thought long and hard and still thinking about it. And these principles are what guide decision making. And so while I won't go into all of the detail on all of these, we might, for instance, make sure that we make clear efforts to plan to avoid catastrophic harm to the communities where projects operate.
How does this work? For instance, how does the avoidance of catastrophic harm work?
Yeah, I mean, it would depend. I mean, it could be that a project doesn't demonstrate with sufficient confidence that its drought-fighting measures avoid catastrophic harm if there was actually increased rainfall, and there wasn't confidence that this was a very low probability future. Now, on the other hand, it might be that even though there may be uncertainties in the future climate, some measures would both protect against future droughts but wouldn't hurt the community if there was to be the reverse. And so we'd want to encourage those sorts of projects to be the decisions made. But another key point is we may still go forward with the project with some negative impacts if the net impact is positive. But catastrophic harm is something we never want to create the conditions for enabling. We don't want to create a flood defense that, if poorly designed, puts the community at greater risk if the defenses are breached, for instance.
Okay, so it sounds like trade-offs are possible.
Yes, more than possible. They're going to happen. They're necessary. And we need to consider the principles holistically. So, for instance, where completeness or accuracy within how we assess a potential project is poor, then we have to apply conservativeness much more rigorously.
Okay, well, what are some of the biggest challenges with all of these principles?
Community acceptance, for instance, can be an extreme challenge, but it's extremely important to get that right. And we believe that the entire community, the whole array of classes, minorities and different groups, genders, given a real opportunity to provide feedback. And if some in the community can show that they will be negatively impacted, it's really important that acceptable measures are taken to redress those impacts.
Okay, well, thanks. I'm digging down further into the table of contents. I noticed that guidelines on baselines get a lot of coverage. How does the Higher Ground currently view baselines?
Yes, since we have a quantified metric, it is extremely important to have very explicit guidance on how the baseline is derived. And let me just show you this graph here that we put in the framework.
Okay, yeah, that's what I mistakenly turned to before. It's a very attractive graph. Could you go a little more into what's actually going on in it?
I think it could be made more attractive with graphic design. However, let me try to take us through this here. First, we need to know that the baseline is considering impact costs. Income comes into play as well, but for each 10-year period between revalidations, the income equalization factor is constant. So what changes in calculations is economic loss or damage. And generally, projects will focus on situations where impact costs are going up owing to climate change. It doesn't have to be the case, as a community might be able to lower its climate vulnerability by capitalizing on some climate changes that bring some benefits. And Andrew alluded to the fact that some crop yields, for instance, may go up in certain regions owing to climate change. But at any rate, over time, we need to consider not just the changes in impact costs that a project brings, but consider 3 scenarios that I put down here, that 3 scenarios and how they relate to each other. And so first, we have a situation where there's how much the impact costs are without any project, okay? That's the first thing we need to consider. And then secondly, we may have a project that brings about some climate resilience, but it doesn't consider climate resilience when it's designed. And I think there are quite a number of projects like that right now out there. For instance, a new or improved drainage project could offer some climate resilience, but it may be designed based on historical 100-year flooding incidences, but it's not considering that these 100-year floods may become 20-year floods in the future because of climate change. And then finally, area C, a project could be designed to take into account climate change, and this will bring about even lower impact costs.
Okay, well, could you define then what is the VRC baseline?
Yeah, it's the impact cost of a project that ignores climate change unless the project developer can establish that no project would have been undertaken unless a project qualified for VRCs. And in this graphic, the baseline, it's in terms of impact costs, is areas B and C. So it's this area here. Unless the developer could prove there were sufficient barriers to getting any project going. This could be because there would be insufficient funding without a VRC revenue stream to do anything, or maybe the project wouldn't be required without climate change. In this case, area B wouldn't exist. In effect, the project has to be additional. It can't just be a water project, for instance, that brings about some protection from climate change, but would happen regardless of climate change.
Okay, so how would you calculate VRCs with this baseline?
As you outlined, you can take the income equalization factor, which is one number as readjusted every 10-year period, and multiply that. What in this year is area C for the period that is being credited.
Okay, well thanks. It's obviously a lot to digest, and there are obviously many issues that we can't cover completely in this short session. We do have a 30-minute technical sandbox for any participants who want to delve deeper into the standard framework following this in our Q&A session. Just now, could you just tell us a little more about what you think are some of the key areas and issues, especially those you're working to further develop?
Yes, there are many issues where we have put a considerable amount of work, but we're definitely interested in further work and feedback from others before we release our first public standard framework document. And so a few of these are, we need to work more on some of the principles and defining them. Community acceptance is one, for instance. We have a process in place, and we've looked at how other standards in other fields consider a fair level of community engagement. Another issue is determining an acceptable level of uncertainty. Of course, we need to meet the framework principles, but there are trade-offs, and just because we don't have a clear view towards future climate and future climate impacts and there's costs, doesn't mean we shouldn't grant VRCs to projects that are likely to provide systems with greater climate resilience. How should the standard estimate and redress project leakage, which is the impacts, positive or negative, of a project on systems outside of the project boundary? Now, this can happen in a number of circumstances, such as when a particular project's management of water in one area of a watershed affects users upstream or downstream. Another issue is on discount rates and what's acceptable. Setting at 0 doesn't really reflect human behavior, but setting above 0 creates intergenerational inequities, as we're saying that we today matter more than our grandchildren. And there are approaches that we've researched that economists have made on how you could have different rates and so on for different time periods. But this is something we want to work further on. And then there's a fundamental question over how applicable could this be, given that it's based on cost-benefit analyses, on indigenous communities where we don't really have markets in the sense that we have in non-indigenous communities. So does it apply there? That's, I think, a big question.
Okay, well thank you for that. One final thing. What are you going to do with the standard framework now that you're here, now that you're at this point?
Well, we'd like to broaden the dialogue and get more stakeholders involved in advance of our public release. So I'm most interested to discuss this with anyone who'd like to get more involved.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We do have a few minutes for participants to ask any general questions of Carl and myself. With proviso, we can better address technical queries in the sandbox session that follows. So just taking a look at the chat board.
Don't see anything. I see someone is saying something, so good. And
just waiting for them
Cruz,
to...
I believe you were with us last time, so I very much thank you for joining us once again. I hope both sessions have had value added for you. Do we have modeling capacity to estimate the baseline as part of the work you are doing? Meaning sort of the in-house modeling capacity. Linus, we've developed a few VRC calculators. Maybe you could speak to our work past and planned and current on that.
Yeah, well, I mean, as you gather, it's a VRC project is a complex set of calculations bringing together various disciplines. So the heart of what drives it is what we call the VRC calculator, which is essentially it's a cost-benefit analysis based on a present value evaluation of a stream of VRCs that would be generated based on the various baselines that Carl discussed, i.e. what would happen given likely climate change, if no project, what would happen if all things were equal, we call it, without climate change, and then what would happen if there were climate change, which we call the VRC baseline, and finally what happens once you actually institute measures to adapt to climate change. And that involves costs, capital and operational costs in terms of infrastructure and obviously monitoring, evaluation, repeated activities, and the benefits essentially are the avoided climate costs calculated as a stream of VRCs. Now into this, we do have to field a lot, and just to mention, we do have, you know, as Carl said, we do have a lot of VRC calculators that we're developing right now. Each methodology has a slightly different one. They have the same essential, sort of the same essential guts, but the feed-ins for what the valuation is would differ between a project involving real estate value and say a project involving crop receipts. So we're developing methodologies for say flood damage. We've also developed one for crop damage, and you know, the VRCs that can be obtained by recovering from those by alternately building flood defenses and switching crops, instituting agricultural projects. Those portions involve another level of expertise, which calls upon more subject experts in the field. For instance, for a flood defense project, you would need to model what happens to community in a flood, and you know, as it happens for a project we're trying to develop right now, in South Asia, we do have people who are GIS experts and people who are hydrology experts who are working on it with us. Finally, kind of the highest level of monitoring that sort of drives everything is the modeling of climate change effects, which we've sort of worked on at different scales as we've gone on, and we're really trying to refine it so that it's something that's easily replicable. Obviously, it has to be something that's driven by you have to have a baseline assumption as to what is going to happen to the overall world climate. We're basing, right now, as a default, we base that on the representative concentration pathway. It used to be there was a different term for it before the fifth assessment, but it was it's now the representative concentration pathway for 2.5 degrees, I believe. So it's based on a UN UNFCCC IPCC modeling of how the world climate is going to change. Based on that, you have to develop regional models, or at least a regional outlook as to what that's going to do to your various climate vectors, including rainfall, temperature rise, evapotranspiration, and how these things drive issues like flooding and crop loss. So, yeah, it's as I said, we strive to use the very best modeling available. We have a very sound central VRC calculation modeling capacity. It's sort of the trick that we hope to get through the cooperation with people like you folks is modeling on that feeds into that in terms of the impacts of climate and the impacts of the intervention.
Yeah, thanks, Linus. I think that covers it. Yeah, so we have some calculators. We have a basic architecture. We're working with a team, people, a few of our team members from Bangladesh, including climate scientists, disaster management professional, and a GIS expert who's also an urban planner, on this urban flood calculator. And we're also trying to make the architecture of it more user-friendly by having a front end and back end that are clearly delineated. But it's going to be in the future. We don't see ourselves necessarily being in the business of doing methodologies for every single project type out there. We see that this is a potential business opportunity for others, but we want to kickstart the process by getting some experience in how we can work in practice based on real project data, so that we can make sure that the framework and the design and the management, that we understand what we're doing, and that we can provide guidance and templates and methodologies that are fit for purpose and realistic. So I hope that helps.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah,
is there any other? Yeah. Oh, sorry, Linus. Yeah,
no. Just want to thank you for the question.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Are there any other questions right now? If not, what we're planning to do, and we have a smaller audience this time, which is understandable since we didn't do it. We just let more or less everyone who registered for the last one know about it, and then I announced it in Rabat there was a adaptation metrics conference. So there's a smaller group, but I really appreciate all of you who joined us today, or last time and today. If anyone wants to stay on, the offer still stands that we're going to take a short break and then come back in a few minutes. And if anyone's still here, feel free to tap out your questions. We'll put a little whiteboard on, and we'll be happy to just cover anything you'd like that we're able to in the next 30 minutes. But for those of you who don't really want to go to that depth, I'd just like to say that, thanks for your excellent question. And also, I know there are a lot of other questions that could be addressed. Don't hesitate to get in touch with us. And also, maybe you have questions for Andrew, and certainly we can bring you together with him. I'd also like to urge all of you who have technical issues, definitely get in touch with us if you can't during the sandbox. both Linus and I are certainly available, and I think I'll show you, here's our contact details, at least mine, but I can get you in touch with Linus, who, as the technical manager, might be more useful for some discussions, no doubt. But this concludes the main section.
Our first name,
yep.
at climateadaptationworks.com.
Yeah,
for any of us.
Right, yeah. And so, this concludes the main section. And Gareth, yeah, it's good to hear you. It's been a while since we've been in touch. I love to catch up with you. So this concludes the main section, and we hope it's interesting, and hope it begins a dialogue and cooperation. And we're excited to turn this into a viable instrument to help make the world more resilient to climate change. So thank you and goodbye. And